They've just created these standards for cannabis. And the last thing I want you guys to think about, if any of you are thinking about going to the sciences or thinking about dropping out of the sciences, there's going to be right now is not a very good time to be a scientist. I mean, it's like the lowest research funding since the creation of research funding. I skipped out of academic. I was in academia for almost 10 years and, saw my chance to get out because there was, funding was drying up left and right. But now there's a huge need for young scientists. We're talking about the private sector not being able to fund cannabis. That is slowly going away now that banks, actually can take money from cannabis-related businesses. It's just that they were saying the federal government doesn't allow it, but the federal government says, we never said that. It turns out banks just didn't want to do the extra paperwork for what's called high-risk, high-security bank accounts. So that's why they were refusing to take money. But when money is available to fund research, it will easily outspend NIDA. And so there will be a huge need for young scientists in the future, but right now we need them to help regulate the businesses. There's a huge amount of laboratories right now that are out there testing cannabis for the industry. And there's a great need for biochemists. So if you know any friends, there's a conference I'll mention at the end coming up in April. There are scholarships you can apply to. There are fundraising sites. You can go there, you can meet the other professionals in the industry, scientists, entrepreneurs, private businesses. And even Lyle Crakel will be there. He's a geneticist who's found to grow plants. He's from UMass. Yes. So we'll begin the science portion. We're going to start with a cell, because this is really where a lot of our information about the endocannabinoid system comes from. The cannabis system in our body comes from studying cells. So this is your basic generic cell diagram. And what we have here is the outside of the cell. All right? And this is like the shore of the cell. And this is how it interacts with its environment. And in this sort of opaque flat thing, it's made of fat cells, but it's also has a lot of proteins integrated into it. And that's how it reacts with the environment. A little drug floats by and binds a receptor and it sends a signal. But these receptors come from the nucleus, this nice blue ball here. And so DNA is red, amino acids are what make up proteins. So these amino acid strings get processed, folded, checked for errors, and expressed on the surface. Anything that goes wrong along this pathway can be disastrous. And that's what people are thinking that happens with some diseases. Receptors may not be making it to the surface, so that they can be activated, or perhaps there's a failure to encode certain proteins that are essential for making things like anandamide in 2-AG, which I'll show you structures of later, which are the endocannabinoids that activate the cannabinoid receptors. So as Ania pointed out, the endocannabinoid system, the receptors, were discovered by studying plants. Cannabis sativa, Raphael Mashum isolated in 1964. So what's the big deal about isolating a plant compound? Well, we care because that allowed people to make copies of it, namely radioactive versions, because you knew what the structure of THC was, you could suddenly trace it to where things went. And when they got the first radioactive tracing images of animal remains, they were so dense that they had to keep reducing exposure time because there were so many cannabinoid receptors. Right now, it is considered that cannabinoid receptors, the receptors for THC, the receptors for natural cannabinoid anandamide, there are more of them in your brain than just about anything else. And I think this is hilarious that you go to medical school and it's like, well, you're not going to learn about what the 90% is. We're just going to focus on some glutamatergic neurons, maybe a little serotonin. But the 90%, we're just getting to that. So that's a really exciting time to be in research. But cannabis isn't the only plant that makes cannabinoids. This is really, I find it fascinating. It's the only plant that makes THC, but some of the so-called stem cell compounds, that like lead to being made into THC, which are also cannabinoids, are found on species of rhododendron, liverwort moths, chrysanthemum, and even the plant that makes ibogaine, if you're into that sort of thing. And so the endocannabinoid system consists of endocannabinoids. There's these fat-like compounds that THC sort of mimics their effect. The receptors that they activate, and the enzymes that synthesize and break down the endogenous cannabinoids. And so what does this system do? It helps you to eat, sleep, relax, forget, and protect, which is a great phrase coined by Vincenzo Di Marzo and Raphael Mechoulam. So, regulating appetite. And most people in this room are familiar with that idea anyway. So it helps you to sleep, regulate sleep, helps you to relax, it helps you to forget. Now, if anyone is to think that forgetting is less important than remembering, I would strongly disagree. If I remembered every face I saw on SEPTA this morning in Philadelphia, my head would explode. You need a system in your body to regulate the extinction of useless information, things you don't need. That is so important. In fact, that probably underlies things like OCD or PTSD, where people can't forget things. But also protect. Cannabinoids do not kill brain cells. Phytocannabinoids do not kill brain cells. They are neuroprotective. They are wonderful antioxidants. And they have been shown in numerous assays, numerous basic experiments to protect brain cells from damage. I've even done research, which I have at the very, very, very end of this time, where you can take a petri dish of healthy brain cells from human beings and cancerous brain cells. Give them the same dose of THC. The human brain cells are fine. And you can watch this time lapse over 48 hours, and the cancer brain cells, most of them shrivel up and die. But that's a petri dish experiment, but you can still see that even in the petri dish environment, cannabinoids are non-toxic. There's also one of my favorite scientists in the world, Ethan Russo, has coined the clinical endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. So this is what we kind of talked about earlier when we talked about mutations, diseases that are treated by cannabis that might be due to a deficiency in endocannabinoid production, the levels or types of receptors being made, or in the enzymes that are making the drugs that we use. And so, in order to demystify this and look under the trunk, I'm going to talk about just the receptors, because I think this will help kind of, it'll be fun, and I think I know the most about these. So, when we're talking about a receptor, we're talking about a protein, and for cannabinoid receptors, we're talking about a very specific type of protein called a G protein coupled receptor. It has 7 transmembrane helices of protein. This is a very, very basic image. This is the fat in the cell wall. It's kind of like a little snake in there. And this is where the drug would come in and interact. It lock and key sort of mechanism and sends the signal. But it doesn't sit flat like this. These are very dynamic structures. So this is actually, so it's more like this. Like you have these membrane domains which loop together and are stuck together by electrostatic interactions. So amino acids are made up of atoms, right? And they have certain charges. And so positive and negative charges can link together. You have other amino acids which are, say, more hardy or used for structure. So you might find those in the membrane domain. You have other amino acids that are smaller and more like glycine, think glycerin, they're oily. They can be used for like hinges in the receptors. So these are little machines made up of amino acids. And I'm just going to get more and more complex, so hang on. And this is the same diagrams you've been seeing, but 1-letter abbreviations for the amino acids. So we have a lot of amino acids with a lot of interesting properties. And the ones that are in red are the ones that I actually studied. And so these are kind of like positive, negative charges that hold the protein together. And this becomes important understanding the receptor because when you start to classify drugs and their activities, it makes a big difference. So this is kind of a little table before we jump into the 3D model of the receptor. But I just want to point out that these are what endocannabinoids look like. This is THC. We're very familiar with that one. This is a bicyclic cannabinoid, CP55940, made by Pfizer, which helped to discover the receptors. This is rimonabant. This blocks type 2 receptors. This actually blocks the CB1 receptor. It was the first ever widely prescribed cannabinoid in the UK, in the world, but in the UK. However, it was meant for obese people, people who were like going to die from obesity, because it's like the opposite of THC, right? You give it to people, they don't get hungry. And so it was, people were dropping pounds like crazy. So it became this big diet fad, and people who weren't even obese were getting it, and then side effects started popping up from misuse. And one of the side effects was, well, let's see, if it blocks the receptor, THC activates it, you get, let's say, pain relief, you get neuroprotection, and you get some euphoria. Well, what happens if you block the receptor? Pretty much the opposite. There are reports you can read about where patients developed MS-like symptoms from taking the drug, but later, after discontinuation, they went away. Many of these people who took this drug have suicidal type thoughts. So they pulled it from the market. But these are wonderful research tools because they probably are way more useful as research tools than they ever will be as medicine. So you'll see these compounds used a lot in research because you can block the effect of something, block a part of the system. And this is how science works. If my job was to study a car, I would remove things that I don't think are useful to see how it works. Like, oh, the car still works with a steering wheel. Don't need that. Oh, okay, don't need the brake. The car still runs fine. Like, this is kind of how science works through eliminating things. And then here we have a little bit of a problem child, the indole derivative, WIN55212. It's a prototype compound of a new class of cannabinoids. They've been around for a while, but the indole derivatives make up the majority of the synthetic marijuana stuff, the JWH compounds. So this is kind of where those compounds come from. They were a prototype compound that have a distinct part of the receptor they interact with that is separate from THC. So the idea is, well, if THC and these natural stuff use one part of the receptor, what happens if that part of the receptor gets messed up? You can use compounds like these, which will use an unrelated part of the receptor. It was a fascinating time until they all became illegal. So this is a top-down model. So sort of the last thing THC sees before it dives into the receptor. And it would kind of go floating in here. It would break this electrostatic interaction, which lets the protein move and change its shape and send out a signal. And so, like I said before, just to say we have binding, activation, conformation, and structure. There are different amino acids that make up this protein that have different roles. And we can study this by mutating those. So I can take a charged D amino acid, which is aspartate, and turn it into alanine, a non-charged one, and break this bond and see how does the receptor function. You can do this for all sorts of fun amino acids. It's called mutational analysis. And you take all this information and you kind of put it into a graph. And so we know the structure, we know the amino acids. Let's mutate one and see what happens. And so I looked at all those compounds I've shown before. And this is the wild type normal receptor. It's working great. Lots of potency. You're getting 100-fold stimulation with every compound. But what happens is when you mutate it, suddenly you get this drop-off of the red and the purple and the black ones. Those are at the bottom. And those are THC-like compounds. The green is the indole derivative. So you mutate one amino acid that's important for recognizing certain types of cannabinoids, like THC-like compounds. THC can't bind anymore, but these weird indole derivatives, like JWH018, can still maintain binding. So one of the things I like to say, synthetic pot, it's not. If you're looking for a reason of how these compounds are different, they're activating different parts of the receptor, probably different pathways, and the indole derivatives probably have other off-target effects. So taking all of this kind of together, I mean, what does it give you? It gives you something like this. Oops, that's the wrong one. Go back. All right, let's see. Let's see. Yes, so synthetic pot, it's not. Okay, so we're talking about cannabinoid receptor genetics. We're just going to talk about different types of mutations. They're called trinucleotide repeats, haplotypes, SNP, small nucleotide polymorphism. Small changes in DNA, big differences. So we're just talking about CB1 receptors here, the receptors in the brain, the most abundant protein probably in your brain. Disease associations in animals and humans are mixed up here. I'll try and point them out. There's been, for instance, association with certain types of mutations in cannabinoid receptors with schizophrenia. Well, you have a messed up cannabinoid system. There's an association with schizophrenia, substance abuse disorders, Parkinson's disease, and there's even a weird sort of inverse relationship to the number of mutations and working memory in animals. So if you have this receptor that's important for forgiving and it's messed up, your memory performance will be worse. There's also association between anxiety and depression, as well as eating disorders, as I mentioned earlier, which I think is really, really interesting. Also obesity, think about it, it's a system that regulates appetite. Makes sense that all metabolic disorders could be related to it. And then the CB2 receptor, which is located on immune cells. Remember the image of the guy that had some bright stuff going on around here. That was the spleen, the liver, and other immune tissue. What they find, though, is that people with mutations in CB2 receptors, these are all in human populations, which is fascinating, have either lower bone mineral density or more severe age-related osteoporosis. So I think it was 3 distinct groups of women. I can't remember what the third group was, but one was in France, one was in Japan, postmenopausal. And they found that the women who had more severe age-related osteoporosis had mutations in the CB2 receptor. So the idea is either by enhancing the endocannabinoid system, perhaps in these situations, stimulating CB2 receptors, which THC also activates, you could, in a sense, help them regain bone production. So it's really exciting. The other study that's mentioned here also looked at a group of, as they said, ethnically conserved population living along the Volga River. So essentially like a village of people, living in this quaint little village town. They looked and found that a lot of them had this mutation, one of these RS mutations, and they did some imaging of their hands and found they all had weak hand bone strength. And they related, the only thing they found that was gone awry was mutations in the receptor. So what I'm kind of going with this is that there is an underlying molecular mechanisms that people are evaluating that can help explain why cannabinoids are helping or seem to help so many diseases. So I'm going to move into the sort of hot topic stuff. So that was like 30% of my thesis that I just presented. This other stuff is kind of stuff I've been working on post-thesis defense. And I'd like to start with cannabidiol. I love this compound. I get kind of crazy with some of the things people are saying. So one of the things I've heard, and this group is probably pretty well informed. Anytime you hear a politician talking about marijuana, just remember they're an elected official, but they like to play a doctor on television. So there's no such thing as CBD-only cannabis. It does not exist. Okay? It doesn't exist. Any cannabis that is cannabis has THC and CBD on it. Maybe the CBD is in very minute quantities, maybe the THC is in very minute quantities. But remember, CBD-only cannabis doesn't exist. They're giving kids THC. THC is the proven superior anticonvulsant medication. CBD enhances the effects of THC's benefits. One of the papers that Amy's talked about was The Tale of Two Cannabinoids by Ethan Russo. That study clearly points out, that CBD is there to enhance THC and to reduce side effects. So, and the reason CBD only was first being used was because in California, when people started testing cannabis and CBD strains started becoming available, grab some water here, people needed a way to readily identify it as just sort of a warning saying, hey, you're about to consume way more CBD than you're used to. And so that was just sort of a colloquialism for like Humboldt, it's an analogy that spread and is a misconception. So CBD-rich cannabis. CBD is generally inactive by itself. It has to have something there. It modulates the system. It's not a direct stimulator. It's a really weird concept. And also another thing, when you hear people talk about testing of cannabis, there's a thing called a ring test. You can probably Google this on your tablet or phone right now, the cannabis ring test. One of my mentors that I worked with in Holland for a very brief time at the University of Leiden, he came to California, did a ring test, and he sent out the same sample of cannabis that he had analyzed in an academic professional setting and sent it to 8 different private cannabis labs in California. Different results. So be very wary if an unregulated laboratory is testing cannabis for reporting results, because The whole strength from science comes from revealing how you did it. If no one will tell you how you did it, you shouldn't believe them. So just remember that sometimes I hear people say, oh, it has 0.5% THC. Just take it with a grain of salt, but remember that who analyzed it? How did they analyze it?
Is there like an accreditation to know who is good?
Yeah, there is. And there are some labs who actually have people with PhDs and or back. There's some labs that people have no background in science, and there's some labs that do. And so you kind of have to. Right now, there's we'll talk about later is the patient-focused certification program that's just launched this month. That's doing that right now, making it kind of clearly visible that you can help make the right choice, find out what's accurate and what's less accurate. And the reason it becomes important, is imagine if you got the wrong reading, and this is one thing that scares me, is imagine if someone, before they went on a trip, thought they were taking 5 milligrams and took 500 or something like that. They would wake up in another state, it would not be a good time. But so you're seeing the rise of CBD charlatans, and this is mostly having to do with people who are trying to say, we're going to ship CBD to you. Anyone who's trying to ship a scheduled narcotic to you doesn't have your best interest at heart. CBD is a scheduled narcotic and a legal drug, so Can Chew or Dixie Elixirs, all these CBD-based things, they are not legal, regardless of what they say. They're legal in the state, probably where it's being produced, but no interstate commerce. So, anyway. So, and remember that there's way more information about THC and what it does. There still isn't a clear mechanism for what CBD does. So it gets to the issue of, would you rather take something that you knew how it worked or something that just is a black box approach? So,
Now, are you sure on that? Because if they're bringing the hemp in from out of the country and not growing it, now I realize it's the trash of hemp, but is it technically not legal?
If it has cannabidiol on it, it is still an illegal drug. It is a microgram. It's federally.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I realize that they pegged all of the cannabidiols, but I thought under the guise, as long as it
has to have below a certain percentage of cannabinoids. Yeah.
I think you had a question.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, is cannabidiol itself in the schedule system?
Yeah,
so
no,
it itself
every
as
single
a
one.
molecule is in there, not just
THC.
marijuana, the plant.
Yeah, yeah. They went through and painstakingly listed.
Molecule.
There are 8 or 9 isomers of THC. There's 7 or 6 versions of CBD. They're all illegal, and anyone who makes a drug based off it is illegal too.
I had a question about the Dixie Botanicals. Do you know anything harmful about that?
I don't know anything that's been proven harmful. I just know what I've read and the sphere of information and networks out there.
Because I did order it for my son and used it for a short period of time.
And the issue there is a quality control issue, allegedly a quality control issue because of how they get the pulp, so one of their former chief scientists resigned because upon seeing how they made it was quite harrowing for the scientists because basically they take a pulp that has, so basically when they pull the stalk out of cannabis, the way they do is they just let it rot if they're going to make it for fiber. Then they split that open and pull out the insides, and what's left over, filled with chemicals and contamination galore, is sort of sent to Dixie Elixir, and then they turn that into their products. So they take this chemical sludge that used to be hemp, and then so we
It's
talk
a
about.
good thing I quit.
Yeah. But they have their own media campaign claiming that's not happening, but it's
Okay.
they're not actually opening their doors to say this is, they're not being audited, that's for sure. There's no oversight. So, I think that if you hear these claims, you have to take them very seriously because, it doesn't sound like they have people's best interests at heart.
But then, like you said, if the cannabidiol itself is one of the controlled substances, anybody shipping it interstate would be violating the federal law, so
Yeah.
most likely they're not going to.
I'm not a lawyer, I'm not offering legal advice, I'm just saying from my own viewpoint, no interstate commerce. That's just crazy scientist talk. So, and then cannabis pediatrics. Okay, this is something that people talk about a lot. Gervase and Davinsky. So Oren Davinsky is this really amazing researcher. A lot of stuff I learned about CBD and treating kids, I learned from watching his talks. He's actually going to be doing clinical trials on the CBD in kids with epilepsy. But he came out with this really weird New York Times letter to the editor, or New York Times op-ed. And it boggled my mind a little bit, because here's a guy who has been like spoon-feeding people all the information about small-scale clinical trials about children with cannabis, and like talking about how promising it is, comes out and says, don't give it to your kids. And one of the reasons he gave really like made me like, I had to think about it for a while. One of the reasons he gave was, if you give kids with Gervase cannabinoids, mixtures that have THC and CBD in them, they might develop a brain disease like schizophrenia or something like that, 20 or 30 years down the road. And at first I thought, Gervase kid, 20 or 30 years down the road? Has anyone here met someone with Gervase who's older than 20?
What is Gervase?
So Gervase syndrome is an epileptic disorder, just like Charlotte, we saw earlier in this video. So most of them don't live past the age of 20. So what was he saying when he said that? And at first I thought, well, is he saying he's worried about zombies coming back from the dead with brain disorders? Like, what is he talking about? And then I realized he was implying that people who are taking these drugs are going to live longer than we expected. It's such powerful medicine. But he didn't come out and say that, but that's what he's implying, is that these people are going to live longer than expected. We're going to have to be prepared to treat other diseases that we haven't seen a Gervase person live long enough to develop certain things. So we have to be aware of that. And another thing, and I'm not even going to tell you the researcher's name because the research was so awful, but this guy got a lot of press recently for, I think it was Switzerland or Sweden, one of those crazy Northern Europeans. They basically came out with what I call the green baby hypothesis. The mother smokes cannabis, it's going to irreversibly affect the child. That's basically what they said. And what they did is they took aborted fetuses and basically ground them up, took out some brain cells, and grew the brain cells in a petri dish, and then gave them 10 times the dose that I would have given them in a research lab to kill a cancer cell. 10 times that. They gave it to a single cell, and the cell's shape changed. And so they said, see, here's irreproofable evidence that smoked cannabis, it will affect the brain of the developing child. And I'm not denying that there can be some effect there, but the question is dropping pure THC into a petri dish a good model of smoked cannabis? I don't think so. And then there's some questions that I have that are not answered by science. So when we think about these studies and people are doing experiments and adding whopping doses of THC to things, we don't even know how much THC gets in the brain. What is the concentration of THC that makes it into the brain? What's the amount that makes it into the womb? We have no idea. So just remember that when people are doing these studies. So pure THC is not smoked marijuana. Pure THC is pure THC. Smoked marijuana is a rich mixture of compounds, cannabinoids, terpenes. The terpenes give it the smell and have pharmacological effects all on their own. And it's a mixture of compounds. If you want to think about the difference between THC and cannabis, a whole plant botanical, it's like beer and vodka. There's a little difference, especially in the way they smell. THC has like no smell. So this is if you're going to write down one thing, remember one thing would be this article, A Tale of Two Cannabinoids, the therapeutic rationale for combining tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol by Ethan Russo. He's a senior scientist at GW Pharmaceuticals. And from his paper here, he basically outlines, and it was quoted by Amy as well, CBD may prove to be the first clinical pharmaceutical to modulate endocannabinoid function. Modulate. Does not activate receptors. The only time it's been shown to activate receptors in a laboratory setting is when THC is already there. You need THC for CBD to interact with cannabinoid receptors.
So why is GW producing just a CBD product now?
That's one of their products.
Yeah, but it sounds like
Well,
the chances of that being successful don't sound very high.
Well, the chances of it getting through the United States procedure for a pharmaceutical are pretty high. So.
Sativex has been in approval process for 10 years. It's been used in Canada and the UK for the last 5. So, I mean,
So Sativex.
10 years, Sativex or Sativex.
Just in the U.S. alone. Meanwhile, I think it's available in 60 countries, including the U.S. and Mexico. So Sativex, I actually have a slide on it in a little bit. Sativex is an ethanolic spray, a tincture sprayed sublingually. And every spray gives 2.7 milligrams of THC to 2.5 milligrams of CBD. So it's a roughly 1-to-1 mixture. It's primarily recommended or prescribed for multiple sclerosis. I think it has the record for one of the longest ongoing trials with cannabis out of Spain.
Is it plant material or is it
So
synthetic?
they take a CBD-rich plant and a THC-rich plant. And this is what I drive nuts about New Jersey. They put THC caps and cannabinoid caps on all their plants. GW Pharmaceuticals grows the most potent CBD plant they can, and the most potent THC plant they can, because they turn it into hash oil. And the more you grow, the cheaper it is, the more potent your plants are. So they take a CBD-rich hash oil, THC-rich hash oil, mix them together, dissolve it in ethanol, and there you go. So they make a combination of 2 plants. They keep the level of the terpenes consistent because the smelly components of the plant are. He also has another paper called Taming THC, which outlines the things like limonene, like the smell of lemons, citrusy smells. Smells also found in cloves and black pepper. These sort of smells are also found in cannabis. They are strong anti-anxiety. In fact, limonene, which is also an industrial product, it's really great at cleaning stickers off of walls and things, was wafted into a psychiatric ward in the 60s or 70s as part of an experiment. And most of the patients very reduced the amount of antipsychotic medications because the limonene made them feel sort of happy and less depressed. And so the stuff found in citrus rinds actually has sort of an anti-anxiety effect.
Is that all terpene or is that some of the flavonoid too?
Yeah, flavonoids and terpenes, but mostly volatile compounds. And actually, I saw a presentation where Ethan talked about food as the antidote to like being over intoxicated with cannabis. He's like, sort of an analogy. This lemonade with lemon peel in it and some pesto has pretty much tons of feel-good terpenes in it. Right. So I reached like the halfway point here. We're going to jump a little bit out of some of this nitpicky science stuff I've been talking about. We're going to go more into talking about the Cannabis Monograph, which for me is a historical document and was really, really lucky to be a part of. And I love the far side too. So this is, something tells me it's only half-baked. This is the only marijuana reference I could find in the far side. So, American Herbal Pharmacopoeia, here's the cover. It's very nice. I think this is the University of Mississippi, which no longer grows marijuana outdoors due to ever-increasing issues. One that Lyle Craker talked about, who's a UMass professor I mentioned, who will be speaking in DC at the AC Unity Conference. He talked about one time they'd have these 10-foot tall plants, and they'd walk in, after a weekend, and there'd be these plants like knocked over and looked like they were dragged across the fence. They did a sweep on the perimeter and found, lawn chairs, beer cans, and fishing poles. And it turns out that the students had invented the world's greatest game, fishing for marijuana. But Marco Del Soli, who's been running this program for a very long time, decades, and he inherited the program from his supervisor. He's been growing. And you can talk about NIDA cannabis, as being low potency THC, being an inferior product to what's available. But even low potency THC is an effective medicine. And what's also wild is since it's so consistent from batch to batch, it is actually, we have like 30 years of using the same type of cannabis to treat diseases, which is really remarkable if you think about it. And So I don't know if you've ever seen a NIDA cigarette or know what's in it, but it does have stem and seeds in it. Herb Rosenfeld has said that it's like one of the patients who receives NIDA cannabis says it's like smoking a firecracker. Seeds fly out of it. These broken seeds, open cigarettes at tables and conferences to show people what's in it. And NIDA, didn't approve the cannabis cigarettes to be mean. They weren't like, yeah, it has to be stems in there. Lots of seeds, extra seeds for this guy. No, it wasn't like that. It's because if you use just the flower tops, the cigarette rolling machines get gummed up. So they couldn't mass produce the cigarettes with pure flower tops. They had to put stuff in there to break it up and make it less sticky. So that's why it sort of has a little bit of everything in there. So with the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia, we now have the standards for quality, purity, and potency of the plant that basically allow it to be regulated as a botanical medicine. So regulators can benefit from this, as well as patients and providers, because they have proven testing standards. And guess what? It's becoming mandatory. So 18 states are probably going to introduce legislation this year, mere 18, on medical cannabis laws. And this type of stuff is going to be mandatory. Testing of the product. Like, what a wild thought. Having some sort of way to standardize the product. So this is already going on in California. People are using this to certify facilities. And we're going to take a little bit of look into it. And we're going to play a little game called Sativa or Indica. And you guys are going to play along. But first I'm going to have to beat you over the head a little bit about botanical medicines and the FDA. We're going to go through it a little quickly. But the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994 and the Dietary Supplement Non-Prescription Drug Consumer Protection Act of 2006. So the FDA does regulate botanical medicines in the sense that if you sell them and say they treat a disease, you will likely be fined and possibly prosecuted by them. But the FDA can approve claims for foodstuffs, but they don't. That's basically what it came down to. And that, like in France, right now, if you want to get vitamin C, you have to get a prescription for it. So the FDA tried to do that, and basically the dietary supplement people, like the AHPA, APA, fought back, and they organized one of the largest national grassroots campaigns in health food stores around the country. And basically what they did is have people go into health food stores and throw black blankets or caution tape all over the herbal supplement section. Anyone come to buy their black cohosh or their whatever they wanted, their valerian root, they'd be like, no, you have to come back with a doctor's prescription. That's what the FDA wants. If you don't want that, sign here. And so eventually they passed this act which allowed herbal supplements to be sold as foodstuffs. And so basically, in 1993, the commissioner of the FDA said that they would not approve any proposed disease convention. We can, but we won't. Carrots are too complicated for us. Let's bring us a single compound that we can say is good or bad. So all food additives, ingredients we treat as illegal, like St. John's wort. So like I talked about, APA and the AHP had this grassroots campaign to fight against that. And since like 1994, they've been reintroducing all these herbal supplements back into the U.S. market. And that's why when you get something that say is for blood pressure or some sort of herbal supplement, it says this statement is not in any way about the FDA. That's from the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. So they can say these claims, but they have to say they're not evaluated by the FDA. But that thought needs to be completed because the FDA won't evaluate them. It's not equipped to evaluate them. It's too antiquated. Whatever insult you want to say, that's sort of the thought.
It happened to walnuts too.
Yeah.
With walnuts.
And so so one of the things I've been excited to work on is this patient-focused certification program. So with the AHPA and the AHP, we've developed guidelines so that you can go to these places that have medical cannabis laws, and medical cannabis businesses, and audit them, find out who's obeying the laws. You might want to know whether or not where your medicine's coming from, how it's grown, is it grown appropriately, was it grown in a U.S. park, was it grown in a state of place, are they obeying state laws when they do this? So this is sort of what's going to happen. And so we actually have online courses that are free about every aspect of cannabis, from basic knowledge about the plant and the endocannabinoid system to law enforcement interactions. So if you look for patient-focused certification, ASA, you'll find the website no problem. I have the website at the end of the talk. And these are the little stickers that are going to go on products. So we have manufacturing, distribution, cultivation, and laboratories. So this is all part of the regulatory process. Okay, so now for some really wonderful pictures about cannabis. So we're going to start with some early stuff. This is from the Cannabis Monograph, but these are really old pictures. And this is just to show you just a teaser about the different parts of the cannabis plant, how it grows, how to identify it based on objective measurements. So this Cannabis Monograph book basically provides you a way, all the terminology you would need to describe what the plant looked like, how it grows, what are the name of its parts. And for the first round of our game, we have two different types of leaves, right? And so you guys know whether or not which one is cannabis sativa and indica, like the top one? Indica. Oh, okay, good. What about this one? All right, good. Okay, we're going to go round two. Round two is a little more tricky.
Fat.
So yeah, so basic ways identifying sativa and indica. And the main difference from sativa and indica may not be genetic. This is actually still being hashed out a little bit. It actually mostly probably has to do with how it's grown. You can grow an indica plant to look like a sativa, and a sativa plant to look like an indica plant due to the amount of sun it gets. But there are genetic differences, but phenotype, the appearance itself, the only thing. But it can be a good indication. All right. THC or CBD?
CBD.
Well, someone was paying attention. Okay. All right. Primarily THC or primarily CBD? What would you say for this one?
Primarily CBD.
It's THC. I know, trick question. Really hard to tell at this level, right? Very hard to tell. One of the giveaways is that in the right conditions, some of the cannabidiol-producing plants almost look like hemp with larger spaces. That is not a golden rule or anything, but they kind of tend to be a little more spaced out. And this is just a really good example of it. But yes.
Is there a correlation between sativa and indica and the THC and CBD levels? Like,
They've been
which
trying
higher?
for a while to find that. They're really.
I feel like the rumors that indica's higher CBD. I feel like I've heard that a bunch.
Yeah, that's because indicas are thought to be more like kind of sedating. But the main difference that I have seen based on a guy named Justin Fischetic, he did a combination, it's called a multivariate component analysis. So you take like all these factors and you combine them. And it turned out that the differences between so-called sativas and indicas was that the terpene, the level of the smell, these potent volatile compounds. THC has no smell, CBD has no smell. What you're smelling are like these terpenes, and they affect the pharmacology of cannabinoids. And that's what they were finding was the main difference. There's huge differences in like the spiciness or the sweetness of the plant material. So that would be the main difference. I'd have to look up the exact terpenes, but there are differences. And there's like over 120 that can occur on the plant.
Like,
Okay. All right. So here we have, this is from the monograph, different cannabis, obviously, right? So we'll start with the top left. We'll play the sativa indica game. So what do you guys think of these?
Sativa.
Good. All right. Let's see what's next. All right, what about these? Indica? Possibly. That's a good. I like that. Sativa, indica, sativa, possibly. Well, it is primarily a sativa plant, but it is actually a hybrid. So it's a good one. All right. So what about these ones here? I mean, they look a little bit different, right? Any thoughts? There's no right or wrong. Indica. Yes. All right. They are indica. And okay, now we have sativa, indica. What am I showing here? Well, they look like two different buds next to each other. Not a hybrid. We're not. Okay, so I'll give you a hint. We're not talking about sativa, indica anymore. But I want you guys to guess what's the difference between these and these.
Fresh and dry.
Very good. How old? What's the age difference, would you say? I mean, these look really good, I think, even at this resolution. But how old do you think those are?
Couple months.
A year.
I would say 6.
Those are a year old. And you think about that. Don't you wish you had some cannabis that was a year old that looked that good? Like, that's what this book provides. Standards, storage, purity, identity. It is possible to preserve cannabis in a way that can be useful and have a longer shelf life.
They would
So,
disintegrate.
yeah, most of the time it disintegrates if on, in your trunk or your dashboard, whatever. Yeah, so- Yeah, that may not be the best way to store it. So these are sensitive plant materials. So yeah, so this is basically really fresh harvested material, and this is really 1 year old material. So this is all from the Cannabis Monograph. How do you make a standardized botanical product? All right. Let's see. So, all right. So this is a close-up picture of a cannabis plant, and so these are the little sort of calyxes and other parts of the plant. You can see sort of what I want you to kind of see is these crystalline parts, right? They're not really crystals. They're these little waxy trichomes, and this is a 3D scanning electron micrograph image of little factories that occur on the outside of the epidermis of the plant. And these are little waxy trichomes, and this is essentially globule of hashimones. So this is a little factory, and the cannabinoids come through it and come out of it. and the point I'm going to make with this is that you can get a lot of information. You don't need fancy high-tech equipment to get a lot of interesting information out of the plant. We're going to look at trichomes at a resolution that you could get at a microscope at Radio Shack or something. So this is from the monograph. I'm just going to gloss over it right now because you should buy the book. But, we have glandular and non-glandular trichomes, okay? So we have this big important column called cannabinoid producing. So are they making THC or are they making CBD? You can go down and say, like, well, if you see these sort of little mushroomy looking ones, yes, absolutely. If you see these really kind of short-stalked ones, possibly. We're not really sure. They don't seem to be that productive. What about these big, nice, multicellular stalked trichomes with bracts and things? Yes, absolutely. But what about these smooth, sort of like hair-like ones, these systolic trichomes? No, they do not make cannabinoids. So if you're looking at a plant and you see these little wispy things versus this, you can get an idea, just basic equipment. Is this going to be producing cannabinoids or not? Is it going to be producing a lot of cannabinoids? And there are other tests you can do. But one of the really fascinating things that come out of the monograph that I'm really excited about is cell culture. So in petri dishes, taking stem cells, plants have stem cells, you can dissolve the plant root, and people are taking plants now and growing them in laboratories. And so when you think about cannabis, GMO cannabis is something that you're going to have to think about. The work is already being done. The genome has been sequenced by more than one group. I think it's a group in Colorado now who's privately funded to do this sort of research. But this is all from the University of Mississippi, petri dish grown marijuana, which can be then transplanted to a field and grown. So when you think about, I want trait X and Y from this plant and trait A and B from this plant, suddenly the ability to produce varieties has just gotten a lot easier. So this is another question I kind of gave away already, but do you know where these pictures were taken? Yes, very good. Not Amsterdam, not Morocco, and not even California. So now when people think about regulations, sometimes there's this conception that it's going to do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, I was going to ask about the GMOs. I was going to ask if you think that those would pose a potential health risk, kind of like how foods are.
That's a really, really good question. It's hard to say when you don't have the information available. I mean, there's also not a lot of information about the effect of inhaling things that have been gamma irradiated, but yet there's a pharmaceutical form of cannabis in the Netherlands and Europe that's been gamma irradiated. They haven't even tested to see, is it harmful if you splash something with radiation and give it to someone? Nobody is studying that. So yeah, there's certain questions you have to think about, but I just wanted you people to be aware that there is maybe growing among us, so that people are actually out there doing the research to make GMO cannabis. It's coming. So, but what I was going to talk about is, I don't know if you've ever heard about the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana. This is one of the first sort of big patient collectives out of Marin, California. It's a hospice. But their method of producing cannabis was standardized after years and years and years of work. And it's in the monograph. So how do you take a harvest of cannabis, manicure it, and get it to a stage where you can get enough of it to make it worth, to supply to your patients. So what this also helps people determine is not just how to test for potency, not how to store it, but also how to produce it in a way that is safe and standardized. WHAM is a very influential group in California, and one of the longest, I think, existing collectives. Valley Corral has also published research with people like Ethan Russo. They have a book called Women in Cannabis, and also I believe it's Cannabis and Women in HIV or something like that. It's like 2 or 3 diseases, but they focus on women's health issues in cannabis. And as I mentioned before, the monograph also has analysis and methods, and this is just a snapshot of the methods. Just one little thing, internal standard preparation for use of extraction of cannabis and hashish, chromatographic conditions, if you have equipment for testing it, how do you set it up, how do you run it? And this isn't like saying this is the way it must be done and this is the only way, but this is the method that worked the most reliably, that a lot of people use around the world, and anyone with a gas chromatograph should be able to do this. So this is sort of a litmus test, a standard benchmark. You walk into a cannabis laboratory, they should be able to do this analysis and get a reproducible number. And then it also has abbreviations or summaries of research about compounds. THC and CBD are just shown here, but it has it for all the major and minor cannabinoids. And just sort of the recap, so this monograph is potency, storage, looking at pesticides, other forms of contamination, microbial, fungal, and this is what's called a chromatogram. So when you analyze it in a gas chromatograph or liquid chromatograph, you have time and you have elution points. So the compounds kind of elute in groups because they share weights, like these weigh different amounts. So if you had a box of rocks and you shook it, all the all the small ones would eventually make it to the bottom and the big ones would stay on top. So that's kind of how chromatography works, except that it heats up compounds in gas, for instance, and based on molecular weight, you can determine when things will evaporate, like boiling water. So a gas chromatograph is essentially just a fancy oven, and so you can analyze it. So just kind of show you like THC, just give you an idea of what a piece of data looks like. So how do companies use this? Well, this is from GW Pharmaceuticals. You have here, I don't know, I guess one of them is a CBD-rich plant, one is a THC-rich plant. They cure it, they QC it, they analyze it before and after they run it through liquid CO2 extraction, supercritical liquid extraction to get their hash oil. They analyze the hash oils, they combine them, and you notice there's a little sprig of plant there. Do you guys, it's hard to tell?
Mint.
Mint? Yeah, do you know why they added mint to it?
Flavor.
Yeah, exactly. Make it more palatable because it kind of tastes nasty. I've never tried it, but that's what I hear. So then they finally do the final QC before it's bottled. So there's a lot of science and quality control going on to make a standardized extract. So I'm in the kind of final push here. I know we're almost out of cannabis time, but so basically I just want to say that AHP and the AHPA routinely provide the government with recommendations for how to regulate herbal products. And standards and guidelines exist for regulating cannabis. So when you go out and approach legislators, you don't have to say, hey, you have to reinvent this whole system for regulating. But you can turn to the same organizations, particularly like APA that you've been going to since 1994 and basing all your regulations on. Now they have regulations for cannabis that you can, look to. And the reason these are important is it's not just approved. It's not approved by NORML. It's not approved by a marijuana legalization group. It's approved by people who work with herbal products, a big multi-billion-dollar industry that you can see at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or herbal supplements. they approved the Cannabis Monitor. They approved the guidelines for operations, for laboratories, for dispensaries, for growing cannabis. So
Can you access the monograph? Like on
there is
the
a draft
internet?
version available online. It's the first 40 pages are available for free. So I mean, I don't own it. I wish I did. I'd give it away for free, but it's I wrote it with a bunch of other people, but it's the property of the AHP. So
I'll make
Can
sure
you-
that we get
Can
the
you,
link.
can you buy a copy of it?
yeah, if you buy it through Americans for Safe Access, ASA, it's $25. And thank you. And if you buy it directly through the AHP, it's $50. So yeah.
I'll make sure that we get Jack a link or so we can put it up on the,
Excellent.
on
So,
your
yeah.
Westchester.
So I'd say just, these are things you can bring, and plus there's also the APA guidelines, so there's two things you'd want, but we'll make sure those are available for you guys to look at. So how much more, do you guys have like closing business for the chapter?
They have another program going on after,
So how much more time do I have? What'd you say?
Well, how much more do you have?
I have to talk about marijuana forever.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just
So,
like,
so 10?
wave at me when I have like 2 minutes
And
left.
I've got,
Right,
I've got
say like
one of
10
the
or 15
parents here
minutes.
too.
Okay.
I've got a parent
So-
that wants to.
I'm just going to talk a little briefly about clinical trials in the monograph. And one thing I want to talk about first is that when we were gathering all the original reports that exist about cannabis, many of them are not available on PubMed. There's way more than meets the eye. Many of the state-sponsored clinical trials, that's right, states in the 80s actually conducted cannabis studies, like New Mexico, and I had to go into like libraries in the morning and like look for these original research articles, photocopy them, send them to the AHP so they could include them in the monograph. But there's a lot of stuff you can find, like the state of Tennessee did an evaluation of marijuana and THC in the treatment of nausea and vomiting associated with cancer therapy. There's state trials. It's really kind of wild. So they've been going on for a while. And I'm gonna, let's see, this. So I was,
And that's important too, as some of you, as healthcare professionals or as caregivers, you often hear these arguments, here's a chance or an opportunity where you have things, you can walk in with your book and say, really, let's talk about what we do know and what studies have been, and let's move past how do we come to a resolution. Because we have the information, like you said, what we know, 17,000 published.
yeah, at least.
Another-
So I'm just gonna breeze through these, and I just want you guys to look. So we have the type of study, the type of drug looked at, the outcome, side effects. I think the side effects are interesting to look at. But oral THC, oral THC, oral THC, a lot of oral THC being used. But it wasn't that effective because people with chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting can't keep down a pill. And so the studies basically slowly became, started seeing more smoked cannabis studies, 1.9% THC. You get some adverse effects like euphoria, or temporary induced psychosis, as they call it. So THC, drowsiness, faint euphoria, and lots of that is mentioned over and over again. And some people who were really sick couldn't tolerate the smoke. There were really vaporizers around in 1983 when this was going on. Let's see. So, like I said, we're still in the 80s, and these are studies. 100 people, 169 people, 20 people, marijuana, cigarettes, oral THC, compared with standard drugs used at the time. And cannabis and the cannabinoids were often shown to be effective, if not more effective, without toxic side effects.
We all need one of these books,
Sometimes
don't we?
no side effects were reported, and some people had weird time perceptions and smoked a lot of it. Yeah, so I'm just going to kind of keep going. We're in the 90s now. 2007, I think, is the most recent one for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, where compared with the most modern-day treatment for chemotherapy-induced nausea, vomiting, cannabis or THC was just as effective, which I think is pretty wild. So let's see. So just to sum up, just this clinical trials, smoked cannabis, there was 9 involving over 500 patients, almost 600 patients. And for these types of conditions, inhaled THC is way more effective than oral THC or a pill. Side effects.
Have they done any testing with like vaporizers or stuff like that? For
Yes.
better
Yeah.
health aspects or anything like that?
Absolutely. More modern day ones in the 2000s, they've done it. Donald Abrams is the guy who's done it. And they look basically to see if they work as effectively. And they do. Now they're trying to do like pain studies with vaporizers and stuff. And so this is appetite for mostly HIV/AIDS. I'm just going to go through these because we're short on time. And these are going to be in part 2 of the monograph, the therapeutic compendium, which is coming out soon. Just to kind of give you a perspective of how much research is out there in just looking at 2 things, appetite stimulation and chemotherapy-induced vomiting. Tons of information out there about cannabis and THC. Let's see. All right, yeah. And the last one that I was able to find was from 2007, smoked cannabis, 3 different varieties compared to oral THC. Cannabis was well tolerated in all groups. But they basically chose people who had reported using cannabis in the past, and those people who received it had some experience with the past reported no side effects. So similar with this, since 1975, there's been more than 40 clinical trials looking at the effectiveness of either synthetic THC, oral THC, or smoked cannabis for appetite stimulation. So that just food for thought. Okay. So a lot of times, smoking not the greatest thing to do. I mean, that looks nice and healthy, but if you kind of, that's not so healthy. But the good news is there really hasn't been that much evidence to show that cannabis causes cancer. You have to remember you might be getting a lot of carcinogens from the smoke, but unlike something like tobacco, cannabis has anti-cancer compounds, a rich mixture of very powerful antioxidants. So there might be a little bit of a trade-off there. But when they looked at groups of people, they could not, one study found that there were no documented cases of lung cancer. Another study, which is a little bit better controlled, found less incidence of lung cancer. So not that you're going to never get it, but you'll have a less incidence. And so just to kind of summarize, there's a Unity conference coming up April 4th and 7th for the Americans with Jackson. It's in DC. You can sign up. They have scholarships available. We have fundraise me pages available where you can sign up, let your friends and family know, your social media network know, and people can help to fund you to go. It's a great place to meet lots of other scientists, lots of other people in the industry. I know Lyle Craker will be there, and as well as Roy Upton, who's the director of the AHP. And Martin Lee, yes. And so that's actually, I'm writing a book with Martin Lee now. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's written Acid Dreams and Smoke Signals. And we're working on an endocannabinoid system for beginner's guide, a 100-page or so novella. There's going to be some online videos coming on. There's some podcast material I have from other people's podcasts. I don't know what you guys want or are interested in, but feel free to send me your inquiries on Twitter or social media. I'd be happy to provide you with resources. But for now, the resources I'll give you are ahpa.org. Herbal.ahp.net is where you can find out a monograph. Patient-focused certification is an awful website address, but if you look for PFC patient-focused certification, you can find out more about this process, including the free online courses that are really awesome. And I also blog for East Coast cannabis website called Freedom is Green, a Sensi or Sensible Science blog. So that wraps up most of the presentation. I wanted to show you guys, thank Amy King for inviting me in the SSTP chapter for hosting us, as well as show you pictures of the other cannabinoid producing plants. Don't eat them because they might be dangerous. And so I don't know if there's time for questions, but I'm happy to answer them after this session. So.
Thank you.
Thanks.